It's spring, 1946. Lloyd Bentsen is back down in South Texas. He's sitting around the card table, playing poker with his father's friends. He's a decorated squadron commander and colonel at this point. He beat the odds as a bomber pilot and came home from the war a hero, with a wonderful bride and a new son. So he leans back in his chair, surveys his father's friends, and he's feeling pretty good about himself.
Came back as a major, 23 years old, or maybe 24, but I commanded a little over 600 men in combat. Thought I was pretty hot stuff.
Pretty hot stuff. Out in the world, but at the card table, too. Poker was another skill he honed while away at war. Family legend has it that he won a hefty sum playing cards as a serviceman. But no one knows how much. Suffice to say, he more than held his own with his father's poker group.
And then when I came back, I got into what was his poker game with people of his age. They were playing for fun, and I was playing for money.
They'd been playing regularly for a few months. The conversation one night turned to local politics. Specifically, how the county judge, the lead administrator for Hidalgo County, the Texas county where they lived, decided not to seek another term.
They finally said, somebody ought to beat that guy, and why don't you run for county judge? County judge in Texas, of course, the administrative head of the county, in a powerful position. Finally, they all stopped playing cards and looked at me and said, why don't you run, Lloyd?
This was not on Lloyd's radar at the time, but his father's friends laid out their case. Bentsen had name recognition, thanks to his family's businesses and relationships. He had a record of service, having just come back from the European theater of World War II as a decorated squadron commander and bomber pilot. His father's friends thought, out loud, why not serve the community then, as an elected official?
I said, I don't know whether I want to do that or not. So they talked to me a while, and I said, well, I'm not sure anybody else thinks this. It's a good idea. I said, well, give me a week, because there was very little time left to file.
Bentsen was practical and always prepared. In order to make a decision that would surely change his life, he needed information.
So I spent a week out getting around the county, talking to people, seeing if they'd support me. And finally filed on right at the end of the filing date. Had a very short campaign.
And he won it. Becoming Hidalgo County Judge at age 25, the state's youngest county administrator. He'd played his hand right, beginning a more public-facing life shaped by beliefs in service, hard work, and inclusiveness he learned from his early years in South Texas. I'm Patrick Frank, and this is The Bentsen Blueprint.
Now testing 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Lloyd Bentsen and 50 years of public life. Much of it in his own words.
This will be an interview with Senator Lloyd Bentsen in Dallas at the Federal Building, October 9th.
Bentsen's time in office offers a guide to solving the biggest problems we live with today. Immediately after taking office, given the border area he grew up in, Bentsen recalls wanting to tackle poverty in South Texas first. The area was among the poorest in all of Texas. Latinos and their young families made up more than 80% of the population. So he did what he did in the war and after. He made a plan and took action.
During that period of time, I substantially increased the amount of expenditures for children, care of children, health of children, the welfare department here. Did some things working with the county hospital to try to give better access to pregnant women and children.
He didn't know it then, but that work to try and help the disadvantaged, it would be a driving force of his public life. Here he is talking to an interviewer many years later.
What did you find out that you liked about being county judge and liked about public service at that point?
Well, the ability to make things happen.
Bentsen was responding to a question from historian Lewis Gould about his early days in Texas politics. You're hearing this conversation for the first time on this show.
I thought we made some headway.
In early 1948, Bentsen made a run for the House.
Well, Washington's the center of the free world. Obviously, to make things happen, at least you thought you could, on a much broader scale. I thought that would be exciting, interesting.
Not the Texas House in the state legislature, but the exciting, interesting United States House of Representatives. A special election was going to happen after 7-term Congressman Milton West decided to retire, relinquishing his seat.
Well, he was an able man, but he'd been in there a long time. Times had changed dramatically. And I guess with all the self-assurance of a person of that age, I felt that I could better reflect that changed world.
Bentsen resigned as county judge to run full-time against 3 others for the opening. He knew the competition was tough, especially for someone so new to public service, with experience only in his corner of Texas. He ran on a beat the machine slogan against the establishment-backed politicians. For further inspiration, he looked to the campaign strategy of someone up in New England, a young World War II vet and Democrat just like him.
I'd read about this rich kid being elected to Congress up in Massachusetts, and he obviously had great public relations. And we didn't have much in the way of professional public relations down in the ranch country and on the Texas-Mexican border. So I wrote asking him for his campaign literature and told him I was a product of World War II and was in public office and wanted to be a member of the Congress. I'd like to be serving up there with him. And so, I suppose his administrative assistant responded. And anyway, I received his campaign literature, and it was very well done from his race a couple of years before. So I remember the brochure said, "The new generation offers a leader." And I said, "Well, I like that. That's good. We'll use that." So we did.
Bentsen updated a few things. This young, handsome Massachusetts senator was in naval intelligence. So Bentsen's campaign took out the references to motor torpedo boats and swapped in bomber planes.
And then I looked at that PT boat, and I said, well, we'd have to knock that out. We'd have to put a plane in there, a bomber. So we did. And obviously the birth dates didn't match, so we had to change those. But we didn't change much else because he expressed a lot of thoughts that I believed in and I could adopt without it. And it was stated better than I would have probably stated it. So we used it.
And the borrowed literature resonated with voters. This new versus old positioning helped. So did being a returning war hero. But the race pitted Bentsen against 3 opponents. And getting the word out about Lloyd Bentsen's campaign was a geographical challenge. See, the district spanned 15 Texas counties in all, from the Texas-Mexico border all the way up to San Antonio. That's nearly 250 miles. He had to get creative about canvassing.
It was a tough, hard race, a lot of work. I would even fly a little open cockpit plane and land out on dirt roads. Surprise oil crews, not sure they ever voted. But,
in the end, all the work, borrowed campaign materials, and air miles paid off. Voters propelled him to victory, sending him to Washington at age 27. At the time, the youngest lawmaker in the House of Representatives. So Bentsen goes to Washington.
Well, it was an exciting town, and it was a fun town, and you had time to think and to enjoy things far different from what it is today.
He promised voters a lot, and he wants to get to work. But first, he had some business to take care of.
When I arrived in Congress, I strode across the floor and I introduced myself to Jack Kennedy. And I said, I want to show you my campaign literature. He laughed and said, "Hell, that's mine." And I said, "It was."
John F. Kennedy, the Massachusetts veteran whose campaign material Bentsen borrowed with slight modifications. Mutual respect developed over time. Businessman Bentsen chaired a fundraiser for now President Kennedy November 21st, 1963 in Houston, the night before a fateful day in Dallas. And little did he know then, he'd one day draw upon that relationship with Jack Kennedy again, many decades later when running for vice president. But back to representing Texas as a young congressman. Bentsen finally worked on the national level. And just like he learned in combat, exercising that power is more effective when you build a coalition. It is the foundation for every meaningful piece of legislation he worked on. He learned by watching the leaders among him.
Could you tell it from some of these people at this time that they were not going to be the general run of legislators, that they were likely to be leaders?
Yes, you could see that because they had the respect of other members, and others were looking to them for counsel.
Not long after arriving in Washington, the kid congressman, Lloyd Bentsen, finds mentors in high places. People like fellow Texans, then Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, and his wife Lady Bird, and House Speaker Sam Rayburn.
Well, we would go and spend Sunday afternoon with Lyndon, time and time again, named Lady Bird, at their home. The speaker was a man with a very gruff exterior, and he could be very tough, but he was really a very warm-hearted, kind, thoughtful man.
The powerful House Speaker also hailed from Texas. They became fast friends.
He'd invite 5 or 6 fellows down, and they'd strike a blow for liberty, have a drink, eat, make bourbon and branch water, as I recall. He referred to it. And talk about the day's session and what had happened and what ought to be done the next day. And for a kid congressman, that was pretty heady company.
House Speaker Sam Rayburn's so-called Board of Education included cabinet officers, judges, key committee chairmen from the House and Senate, and at the time, President Harry Truman. Lloyd Bentsen was the only freshman congressman, and Lyndon Johnson the only freshman senator. The heady company of Bentsen's early House years also included names like Representative Henry Scoop Jackson, known for his support of civil rights and environmental issues, and a young lawmaker named Richard Nixon. Republican Gerald Ford was part of Democrat Lloyd Bentsen's freshman class with an office right next door.
Jerry Ford and I were good friends. He office next door to me, and we were up on the 5th floor where freshman members were often put. And our wives had both been professional models, so our wives were friends too, and had somewhat similar backgrounds. But it was a nice, warm friendship.
In fact, such camaraderie developed between those two neighbors that they began a daily competition. Here's Lloyd's son, Land, telling a story he heard from Gerald Ford about his dad.
He said, well, you, Dad, and I, we officed next to each other. We both were prone to getting there early because you got to get your day together, and you're actually there ahead of the staff. And it kind of came down to whichever one of us got there first was there to greet this other one of us with a cup of coffee saying, oh, did you sleep in? And the answer was always, no, I had a breakfast meeting, you know. But that was what political jousting was about back in those days.
The hallways may have been relatively friendly, but this post-war period wasn't all bonhomie. More than 1 million black soldiers fought in World War II, but they came back to an American society that was still segregated. In 1948, Harry Truman had just signed an executive order, number 9980, desegregating the military. The prior year, Truman's Committee on Civil Rights called for equal voting rights. It would be 20 more years before Congress would pass the Voting Rights Act. So back home in Texas, the state used poll taxes to keep black people from voting. Voters would have to pay a poll tax just to register to vote. It priced out lower-income folks, mostly of color, from casting ballots, and it allowed for shady dealing. In his first year in the House, Congress considered a contentious bill to outlaw poll taxes. Here's Bentsen.
Well, I had watched it down in South Texas, and the poll tax had really been used to manage votes and to deny votes. And the poll tax was bought for a great many people and then delivered to them on election day with the idea that we hauled them to the polls and we gave them a poll tax, they went in and vote, and so on. And it was pretty much controlled vote that way, a lot of it. And I felt that was wrong, and that wasn't the way I understood that democracy was supposed to work. And so I voted to repeal the poll tax. And there was the whole delegation voted to keep it, as I recall, except for one other.
It did not pass. The poll tax remained. The arc towards justice may be slow, but Bentsen made his position clear. He would use his role to support civil rights. Meanwhile, in the aftermath of World War II, the geopolitical hot zones back in the late 1940s sound eerily familiar. A quick rundown of what was happening then. In 1947, Truman recognized Israel, leading to the first Arab-Israeli War. In 1949, Chinese nationalists fled to Taiwan to run a separate Chinese government in exile. The Soviet Union expanded its power in Eastern Europe, helping crush the Hungarian Freedom Revolution. On the Korean Peninsula, UN forces split one Korea into two in 1948. The North, supported by the Communist Soviet Union, the U.S. and allied countries backed the South.
South Korean villages awoke to a world suddenly filled with noise and plague. The communists had finally launched their undeclared, all-out war of conquest.
When North Korean leader Kim Il-sung invaded South Korea in June of 1950, Bentsen found himself at a poker game with Secretary of the Air Force Stuart Symington. The secretary asked for support in putting public pressure on the North Koreans.
We were in danger of being kicked off the peninsula. We were losing a lot of American lives. And we were obviously in deep trouble.
Bentsen was young, a clear communicator, and obviously on the rise politically. So he went before the cameras with a warning. 30-year-old Bentsen stands in front of a House office building. The Capitol is in the background. With his characteristic calm, he stares down the barrel of a camera and says,
I propose the President of the United States advise the commander of the North Korean troops to withdraw his forces beyond the 38th parallel within 1 week, or use that week to evacuate civilians from a specified list of North Korean cities that will be subjected to atomic attack by the United States Air Force.
Bentsen threatened an attack by an atomic bomb.
It was not an unpopular speech
No,
at the time.
the speech at the time was very popular, and I had enormous support from the membership for the moment.
The Korean War never came to that. In later years, Bentsen recanted his early position. In 1973, many years later in the Senate, he voted against bombing Cambodia. He said he became a lot wiser since his Korean War speech. But that moment stands as a reminder of the zero-sum Cold War calculations of the time, the unflinching American policy of containment, and how Representative Bentsen was pulled into the arena. While Representative Bentsen navigated conflicts abroad and at home during the week, on Fridays, the experienced card player kept up his game. He hosted a poker night at his house.
I had an old farmhouse on a hill out in Maryland, which was delightful. And, I had a stable, and I had a tack room that I made into a room to play cards. And I would have Lyndon out, which, you know, for a kid congressman to have a senator out to play cards. And I would have Stuart Symington, who was Secretary of the Air. I would have Fred Bentsen, Chief Justice Supreme Court.
Perhaps Bentsen was name-dropping a bit too casually. Here's the list one more time. Lyndon Johnson, Senator and future President. The Secretary of the Air Force, William Stewart Symington, and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Frederick M. Vinson. And you get to know people in a different way when you play cards with them.
Chief Justice, good player, excellent. Lyndon, was just fair. Lyndon would, he'd push chips with both hands. He'd get caught sometimes. A speaker one time said to me, he said, "Lloyd, you never invite me out to your card game." I said, "Well, Mr. Speaker, that's because I understand you don't play cards." And he said, "Well, I can damn sure the bets."
He's talking about Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn. And Rayburn saw something in young Bentsen. He mentored Bentsen as he served 3 terms in the House. One aspect was that the House was in session only 6 to 7 months a year, from January to June or July. Son Lan Bentsen recalls,
we would drive from Washington, D.C., no interstate highway system, down to McAllen, Texas, and move into a house, unpack, and start school. And then 6 months later, get through the Christmas holidays, and you pack up and you move out of that house and you get in the cars and you drive to Washington to a new lease house and start a new school for 6 months.
After 3 terms, or 6 years of this, Representative Bentsen decided to call it quits. In the halls of Congress, word travels fast. Once the Speaker heard about it, he summoned Bentsen to his office.
He said, "Lloyd, it's a damn fool thing you're doing." And I said, "What this time, sir?" And he said, "Well, quitting." He said, "You're only 33. You've been here 6 years." He said, "You haven't had an opponent since your first election and none in the offing." He said, "You're from a safe district." He said, "Why, at your age, in another 25 years, you could be Speaker." And I thought, my God, 25 years. At that time, they paid us $12,500 a year, and there's no way I could cut it on that.
So Bentsen does something few politicians do, gives up power.
And I said, "Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, but I've got a wife and kids, and I sure need to build a stable. If I'm going to send those kids to school or to college and to take care of her, and I guess I'm going to have to go back and try to get into business." So that's what I'm going to do.
And Lloyd Bentsen, he keeps his word. It's 1956. Lloyd Bentsen is, at 34, retiring from 14 years of public service. He's back in Texas, in Mission, trying to figure out what to do to support his family. He already surprised Texans by deciding to go into business when his name had been touted as gubernatorial material. So what business would this lawmaker get into? Word got out that he was looking. Someone offered him a role at an oil company, but he turned that down. Then, his dad, a figure that would always loom large in his life, weighed in.
My father said to me, he said, "Why don't you start that insurance company you've always told me I should start?" I said, "Well, I don't have any money. I can't do that." And he said, "Well, I have some mortgages, and we could contribute those as assets to the company."
Bentsen agreed on one condition. He wanted to start the company away from the town he grew up in. He told his dad,
"In all candor, I don't want you looking over my shoulder."
but where to go?
I was debating between Austin and Fort Worth and Houston. We had many friends in Fort Worth who were warm and kind and wanted us to come there. And we always loved Austin. It's such a delightful town with the university and the politics that we enjoyed, and a lot of friends we have there.
Dallas and Fort Worth were financial centers at the time. Austin, a seat of power, is the state capital. But Houston, the swampiest town in southeast Texas, that's where business seemed to be happening.
But we went to Houston because it was exploding in growth, and went to visit the Hobbies. Company Hobby knew this Hobby, and they're a home, lovely home, and had coffee with them that afternoon. And I remember Ovita said, "Well, why don't you come to Houston? Eventually everyone will anyway."
Welcomed in by the governor himself, the Bentsen family moved to Houston, built a house off Memorial Drive in the heart of the city, and found it welcoming to newcomers from the valley.
And it was a town that welcomed newcomers. It wasn't any closed society because so many were new people there and they were looking for friends. And the leadership wanted you to be a part of it. So they took you in.
Now settled in Houston, with his kids in the same school all year long, Bentsen led the newly incorporated Consolidated American Life Insurance Company, and quickly it grew to the point that he began acquiring similar companies in other states. In 1957, he brought together the capital and a bank loan to acquire Lincoln Liberty Life from Nebraska. He first went to see the head of the bank in Dallas, Republic Bank, for the loan.
I told him I wanted to borrow $7 million for a year for Consolidated American Company. And he said, "How are you going to pay it back?" And I said, "I'll pay it back in a year."
Yet again, he kept his word. The company became successful beyond his original imagination. In less than 10 years, Bentsen attained the financial independence he wanted. He then acquired more capital to grow the company beyond life insurance into a diversified portfolio. Land recalls.
So all of a sudden, they were now operating in 14 states, and they had a sales force out there, and then they started expanding the insurance functions, started acquiring financial institutions like banks, a savings loan, and importantly, a pension advisory firm, a mutual fund, and it became a pretty diversified Midwestern organization.
The company went public as Lincoln Consolidated, far beyond its insurance company roots. By then, it was a diversified financial institution. He built his company into an empire that was sold in 1972 in a $30 million deal. Senator Bentsen said all his business dealings across so many industries taught him firsthand how the private sector works.
Because I was in a diversified series of things. I was in savings and loans. I was in banks. I was in insurance business. I was in mutual funds. Those are all financial areas where I was. But I was then being asked to serve on boards.
Board experience meant understanding the way various industries and companies are structured and run. It also included national and international operations, broadening his scope of world trade. In addition to the banks and boards, his company built a downtown Houston building, which housed the Sheraton Hotel. And this hotel gave Bentsen an opportunity to be pragmatic about civil rights again, but this time on the local level. It's 1964 now. The landmark Civil Rights Act, which would formally end segregation, is working its way to passage in Washington.
I can recall that you had no integrated hotels in this state. And so I called Ernest Henderson, who was the head of Sheraton Corporation. And I said, "Mr. Henderson," and who operated the hotel, and I said, "I think it's time that we cross that barrier and that we integrate this hotel." And he said, "You don't think it'll be a problem?" And I said, "No," I said, "It requires some adjusting. But I just really don't think it's right that because a man, color of skin, happens to be black, that he can't stay in a hotel in Houston. I think that's wrong."
Within months, the Sheraton became a go-to destination for prominent black conferences and gatherings. Despite the context in which he lived, Bentsen stayed consistent on inclusivity for communities of color.
I think it's damn outrage that we would say that we would deny public services, that we would treat people of different races differently.
The blueprint for the future was there. Charge ahead and make change for the issues you believe in. And returning to public life, now that his family was secure, seemed the most effective way to do it.
Be sure you go to the polls November 3rd to help Lloyd Bentsen help Texas. He beat Bush.
That's a TV advertisement from 1970. After 16 years in the private sector learning how the economic system works firsthand, Bentsen again turns his attention to public service. But he chooses possibly the most difficult path to get back in. First, as a Democrat in Texas, he chooses to take on the nationally known two-term progressive incumbent, Senator Ralph Yarborough.
I'm under no illusions about this being a tough race. I know that.
The Bentsen campaign linked his opponent to the hippies in the streets and the Chicago riots. Bentsen ran as the conservative Democrat. Here's his son, Lan.
Nobody knew him. And you're running against an incumbent United States senator. And so it was Bentsen, senator for the 70s, and the letters were in a fluorescent orange. It really looked like Halloween. You would roll out your message, and we are moderate, conservative, financially oriented, patriotic, and we are the future. And we just keep saying that over and over again.
The bitter intra-Democratic Party contest is where the race was likely lost or won.
And you would have as big a division inside the Democratic Party as you have right now between the Democratic and Republican parties. So the divisiveness of the primary was the end of the election because whichever side won was going to win the general election. It was going to be Democrat no matter what.
He won the hard-fought Democratic nomination with 53% of the vote, helped by hammering Yarborough's opposition to the Vietnam War. His television ads featured riots and tear gas from the 1968 Democratic Convention, with the background voiceover linking Yarborough to Gene McCarthy, who Texans back then considered ultra-liberal.
Texas needs a Democratic U.S. Senator who is free to speak out for the people of Texas. We need Lloyd Bentsen in Washington.
After eking out that win, he faced a Republican Houston congressman. Perhaps you've heard of him, George H.W. Bush. Bush had expected to be facing Yarborough. Now, both Bentsen and Bush positioned themselves as pro-business and ran as patriotic conservatives.
All those business people that favored us during the primary, now they're in a position they couldn't lose. So they sat on their wallets, and all of a sudden we didn't have the money we needed in the general election. And we found that our strongest point was that Texas needed at least one U.S. Democratic senator.
With donor money tight, the game turned to rural areas. A ground game to scrounge up votes from all 254 counties of Texas. The Bentsens found themselves on a twin-engine campaign plane again.
Small towns, medium-sized towns. Walking the streets, going into the stores, putting long, hard days in the cattle sales, county fairs.
Money ran tight. Bentsen borrowed $300,000 to keep TV ads on the air.
Congressman Bush is relying on President Nixon to elect him to the Senate. If you like these policies, vote for Bush. If you think we can do better, vote for Lloyd Bentsen. The choice is yours on November the 3rd.
And come Election Day 1970, he beat Bush by a 53-47 margin, the same margin which he defeated Yarborough. To sum up, Lloyd Bentsen beat an incumbent Democratic senator and a future president in a single 6-month period. He would return to Washington a much more seasoned, experienced, and knowledgeable public servant than he was in his 20s. Ready to roll out a series of policy proposals that would change America forever. Senator Bentsen's Senate career got off to such a seamless start that by 1974, in the wake of Watergate, and with encouragement from some Senate peers, he decides to try to make a run at the highest office in the land. His son, Lloyd Bentsen III, recalls,
25 people ran for president that year, whatever the number is, 15 people. It was just absolute. They're cartoons of, this galloping horde of people running for office. And so that must have reflected a sense in everyone's mind that it was a wide open race.
After Nixon, prospects looked good for a Democratic candidate. Several notables, including Senator Henry Scoop Jackson of Washington, Representative Morris Udall of Arizona, and Governor George Wallace of Alabama had already entered the race. Bentsen thought a change in delegate selection procedures gave everyone more of a chance.
Probability was where there would not be a winner-take-all in most of the states, that there'd be a bargaining at the convention, and wouldn't be just one fellow having won it all by convention time, and that I could be a part of that bargaining for whatever it was worth.
Running to his right was George Wallace. To his left, Georgia's Jimmy Carter.
I had decided that I would not go into New Hampshire or Iowa, but would try to go into some states later on where I might be stronger and then be a part of the bargaining at the convention. That was obviously, in retrospect, a flawed strategy. So I did not go into any of the early states.
Carter took a different tack, focusing on the early nominating states.
He said his name was Jimmy Carter, and he was running for president.
So by the time the convention drew near, Carter was a household name.
And he was intriguing to the press. He represented something quite different than Washington that they were accustomed to. He was a peanut farmer. He was an outsider, and they liked that.
Here's Bentsen's son, Lloyd III, on his father's campaign.
All of that hard work and all that discipline, which was his forte, wouldn't separate him from this mass of people who were running for president. You needed to be governor like Jimmy Carter, or you needed to be, something a little bit more than a 4-year U.S. senator.
Senator Lloyd Bentsen put it this way.
Difficult time for a moderate who was looked on as a conservative and who came from Texas and was a part of the Washington establishment already in the eyes of the public. And it didn't work.
So he got out, dropped out fairly early, had no regrets, never looked back.
But one lesson from a shuttered presidential campaign? Bentsen's outdated campaign apparatus. Modern campaigns were all about resources and data gathering and strategy and media and staffing and messaging and all of those things in concert at the same time.
And so he sees the big picture and he says, boy, was I educated by these extremely organized political groups.
He learned he needed a far more modern operation. Bentsen knew how to do the work to get something done, and he loved a challenge. So his next political campaign would go on to reap benefits way beyond just Senator Bentsen.
If running for president was an opportunity, the race showed him an even greater opportunity, which was to reorganize the state.
That's next time on the Bentsen Blueprint. This podcast is produced by Reasonable Volume with guidance from the Bentsen family. It's executive produced by Elise Hugh and Rachel Swaby and written by Elise Hugh. Percia Verlin is our production coordinator. The show is engineered by Mark Bush and hosted by me. I'm Patrick Frank. You've been listening to The Bentsen Blueprint.